I sat at the kitchen table, holding a certified legal document in my hands, looking straight into my father's eyes, while my uncle stood by the doorway, holding a folder full of invalid real estate contracts. They thought they had backed me into a corner on my 18th birthday, demanding that I sign away my grandparents' lakeside home to pay off business debts, completely unaware that I had already closed that door 8 hours earlier. Welcome back to Payback Stories. I'm Sarah, and if you enjoy stories about family drama, betrayal, and karma finally catching up, make sure to hit subscribe and drop a comment. Let's get into it. To understand how my family ended up standing in that kitchen on a bright Saturday afternoon trying to sell a house they did not own, you have to go back 6 years to the summer I turned 12. That was the year my grandfather, Arthur, drove out to our house in his old Ford truck and asked if I wanted to spend the weekend helping him work on the cabin at Cedar Lake. It was a 40-minute drive from our neighborhood in Ridgemont, out past the county line where the paved roads gave way to gravel and the trees grew dense enough to block out the harsh afternoon sun. The cabin sat back from the water, surrounded by tall white pines, with a front porch that tilted slightly on one corner and a screen door that needed a firm lift to latch properly. It always smelled like wood smoke, old paper, and the dry heat of cedar planks that had been sitting under the sun for 50 years. That first morning, my grandfather carried a heavy timber rail over to the south fence line where 3 cedar posts had rotted out near the soil. He handed me a pocket knife and showed me how to press the blade firm against the grain near the base, explaining that if the wood yielded under light pressure, the core was compromised and no amount of paint would save it. We worked steadily until noon, replacing the bad timber step by step without any rush, before going inside where my grandmother, Evelyn, had set out cold glasses of sweet tea and turkey sandwiches at the long kitchen table that Arthur had built by hand the year they bought the land. Later that afternoon, while my grandmother sat on the porch reading her book, Arthur wiped the wood dust off his flannel shirt and looked out over the water. He told me that place would stay in our family for as long as the wood held together, but then he said something that felt strange to a 12-year-old child. He told me that family was not defined by bloodlines or last names, but by the people who actually showed up when work needed to be done. I did not fully grasp what he meant back then, assuming he was just making conversation while we packed away our tools, but he was already thinking years ahead. I spent almost every summer weekend at Cedar Lake after that. My grandfather taught me how to bleed the air out of the water pipes before the first hard freeze in November, how to free the stubborn sash windows in the front room without cracking the glass, and where he had driven the solid iron survey stakes along the property lines back in the late 70s. My grandmother taught me how to keep the bookshelves arranged so the small living room felt open, and she always knew exactly how I liked my tea without having to ask. While I was learning the ins and outs of that house, my grandfather was already quietly meeting with an estate attorney in town to ensure the cabin would remain protected long after he was gone. Back at our house in Ridgemont, the atmosphere was entirely different. We lived in a standard suburban home with 3 bedrooms, a manicured lawn, and a garage that my father, David, used as a home office for his building supply business. My younger sister, Hannah, who was 10 at the time, had the large upstairs bedroom that my parents had recently remodeled with high-end furniture and fresh paint. My room was smaller, fitted with worn carpet left behind by the previous homeowners, but I never complained about it because I spent most of my free time thinking about the quiet weekends at the lake. One evening during dinner, my father brought up the cabin while cutting his steak. He said the property was sitting out there doing nothing while taxes ate away at their income, arguing that they should put the land on the market and reinvest the cash into his supply store. When I mentioned that Grandpa Arthur had always promised the cabin would remain with us, my father let out a short, dismissive laugh and told me I was only 12, insisting my grandfather was just being sentimental. Nobody else at the table said another word about it, and the conversation quickly shifted to Hannah's latest debate competition success, which my mother, Patricia, had already framed to hang in the hallway. I had placed first in the district science fair 2 weeks earlier, but my award ribbon was still sitting forgotten in the bottom of my school backpack. After clearing the dinner plates that night, I noticed a glossy real estate brochure resting on the kitchen counter underneath a grocery list. It was from a commercial builder called Lakeview Properties, featuring headlines about prime waterfront lots and high purchase offers, with a local phone number written in dark ink across the top margin. The handwriting did not belong to my father, meaning someone else had been discussing the land with him. I placed the paper back where I found it, went upstairs to my room, and thought about the long wooden table my grandfather had built with his own hands, realizing for the first time that members of my own family were already measuring his home in dollar figures. My grandfather passed away 2 years later. During the spring, I turned 14. The funeral took place on a damp Tuesday under a gray sky, with cold metal chairs lined up on the wet grass near the gravesite. I sat in the front row holding one of his old plaid handkerchiefs, listening to the wind through the trees while people offered their condolences. During the reception at the local community center, I noticed my father standing near the back wall with his brother, my Uncle Michael. Michael was a licensed real estate agent who always wore expensive shoes and spoke in quick, authoritative tones, and he was holding a thick manila folder tucked under his arm while my father listened intently. As I walked past them to refill my glass, I heard Michael tell my father that they needed to move quickly on the lake property before probate proceedings became complicated. Standing there at 14 years old, I realized they were already planning how to liquidate my grandfather's home before the burial soil had even settled, though I had no idea back then that Arthur had already neutralized their plans years in advance. My grandmother survived for another 2 years, but her health declined rapidly during the spring of my 16th birthday. The final time I visited her at the care facility, she reached out from her bed and gripped my wrist with surprising strength for someone so frail. She looked me straight in the eye and whispered that the cabin belonged to me, warning me not to let my father and uncle push me aside, and she made me promise to hold on to it no matter what they said. I gave her my word right then and there, and she leaned back against her pillow and closed her eyes for the last time. The evening after her funeral, my family sat around our kitchen table in Ridgemont, and my father let out a long breath before telling my mother that they could finally clear up the lake property once and for all. He spoke with a sense of unburdening, as if a difficult hurdle had finally been removed from his path. Later that night, I heard my Uncle Michael calling my father from the driveway, his voice loud and upbeat as he discussed timelines for listing the parcel. Standing in the dark hallway with a glass of water, a cold realization settled over me that my grandmother's passing was not a moment of grief for them, but an opportunity to convert her home into liquid capital. From that point forward, maintaining the cabin became my quiet, private mission. Every Saturday morning, I got into the rusty sedan I had purchased using money earned from babysitting and drove out to Cedar Lake. I repaired damaged window screens, replaced dry weather stripping around the frame of the back door, and swept wet pine needles off the roof shingles because my grandfather had taught me that trapped moisture was how wood rot began. Back in Ridgemont, the family dialogue shifted entirely. My father stopped referring to the house as Grandpa Arthur's cabin and began calling it the family asset during Sunday dinners. Uncle Michael started visiting our house more frequently, often bringing printed listing reports and property tax statements to lay out on the dining table. When I gently spoke up during one dinner and asked about my grandmother's explicit final wishes, my mother put her fork down with a slow, practiced patience and told me that my grandmother had simply been emotional at the end of her life, adding that real estate decisions were strictly business. Business was the word they used whenever they wanted to strip sentiment away from something that used to mean love. By the time I turned 17, my father became far more direct about his intentions, repeatedly telling me that once I reached 18, we would address the lake property together as a family. The way he delivered that line made it clear that working together meant doing things entirely on his terms. One cold afternoon in November, while cleaning out the back hallway storage closet at the cabin, I pulled away a stack of old wool blankets and discovered a heavy cream envelope tucked inside a wooden chest. My name was written on the front in my grandmother's deliberate handwriting. Inside was a single business card for an attorney named Kathleen Miller, and underneath her contact details were the words Tremaine Family Irrevocable Trust printed in crisp dark ink. My hands remained steady as I read the card, recognizing immediately why my grandmother had placed it there. She knew I would be the one physically working on that house and cleaning out the cupboards, while my father and uncle were busy looking at real estate estimates. I slipped the card into my wallet, decided not to mention it to anyone at home, and returned to my chores. 3 months before my 18th birthday, Kathleen Miller reached out to me directly. She called my phone on a Thursday evening while I was sitting at my desk working on math homework, introducing herself as the legal counsel who had represented my grandparents 6 years prior. Her tone was steady, professional, and clear, and she requested that I come to her downtown office the following Saturday morning without informing my parents. When I arrived at her office, I found a modest space lined with filing cabinets that smelled faintly of old paper and fresh coffee. Kathleen was a sharp woman in her late 50s with silver hair who did not waste time on small talk. She opened a thick blue folder on her desk and explained that 6 years ago, right after I turned 12, my grandparents had established an irrevocable trust that encompassed the Cedar Lake cabin, a primary savings account, and an investment portfolio valued at roughly $2.1 million. All of those assets were held securely within the legal trust structure, and I was named as the sole primary beneficiary. As I sat in the leather chair trying to process the scale of what she was telling me, Kathleen explained the legal reality of the situation. Because my grandparents had officially transferred the title of the lake property and financial accounts into the irrevocable trust while they were both alive and mentally sound, those assets never became part of their personal estates upon death. That meant the cabin was completely outside the jurisdiction of probate court, and my father and uncle possessed zero legal claim to any portion of it. She slid a certified copy of the deed recorded 6 years earlier across the desk, showing the county stamp clearly marking the owner as the Tremaine Family Trust. When I asked why my grandfather had kept this entirely secret from his own sons, Kathleen took off her glasses, looked at me directly, and quoted my grandfather's exact words from their initial consultation. He had told her that his sons would sell that lakeside cabin before the funeral flowers had even wilted in the grass. The room went completely still as I stared down at the legal document bearing my name. Kathleen then leaned forward and added one critical piece of information. Someone had gone to the county recorder's office within the past month to file an official title inquiry regarding the Cedar Lake parcel. I returned home that afternoon paying close attention to every conversation in our house. The following Sunday, Uncle Michael came over for dinner, and afterward, he and my father went out to the garage to talk privately. I walked into the adjoining utility room to put away laundry, where the thin connecting door allowed me to hear every word clearly. Michael was telling my father that he had already signed a formal purchase contract with Lakeview Properties for $450,000, but he needed to clear the public record before the final closing date. When my father asked how they were going to clear a title registered to deceased parents, Michael explained that they would execute a quitclaim deed as sole surviving next of kin, file it with the county recorder, and transfer the land directly to the builder. My father paused for a moment and asked if that approach was entirely legal, to which Michael casually replied that county clerks rarely questioned standard transfer documents between surviving heirs. Then my father brought up my name, asking what they would do if I objected. Michael dismissed the concern instantly, saying I was only 17 and had no standing to interfere, adding that by the time I turned 18, the sale would be fully recorded and finalized. He told my father they could hand me $50,000 for college expenses once the deal closed, claiming I ought to be grateful for the money. Standing in that laundry room, I felt a cold clarity take hold of me. My uncle had entered into a legally binding contract to sell waterfront property for nearly $500,000 without holding valid title, on land locked inside an irrevocable trust he did not even realize existed. That night, I sent a brief message to Kathleen Miller letting her know that my father and uncle were moving forward quickly. She replied within minutes, telling me to meet her at her office the following Saturday so we could prepare our legal filings. When I met with Kathleen that weekend, she drew a clear line on her desk pad outlining our timeline. She explained that while the county recorder should automatically reject any quitclaim deed submitted by my father because the chain of title belonged to the trust, an illegitimate filing accompanied by a false affidavit of heirship could create a cloud on the title, tying the cabin up in expensive court battles for years. To prevent that from happening, we needed to strike first by submitting my formal acceptance of successor beneficiary status the exact moment I turned 18, followed immediately by filing a legal notice known as a * lis pendens at the county recorder's office the next morning. That filing would publicly flag the title, freezing any attempt to transfer or sell the property. Kathleen looked at me thoughtfully and reminded me that my grandfather had hired her specifically to shield me from my family's greed, not to negotiate terms with them. When I got home that evening, my father was standing in the kitchen in a cheerful mood, proudly announcing that he and my mother were hosting an 18th birthday party for me the following Saturday afternoon, complete with relatives and neighbors. He smiled warmly and gave me a side hug, completely unaware that in 9 days, his entire plan was going to crumble. Holding that secret while living under my parents' roof was one of the most mentally exhausting experiences of my life. There were moments when I felt an intense urge to walk into the living room and tell my father directly that I knew everything about his hidden deal with Lakeview Properties, but I knew Kathleen was right. If I tipped them off early, Michael would try to find another legal loophole or document to complicate the property title before my birthday. So I remained calm, did my schoolwork, and waited for the clock to run down. 5 days before my birthday, my mother sat beside me on the sofa in the living room and used her soft, carefully measured talking voice. She told me that now that I was becoming an adult, we needed to make collective choices for the family's future, explaining that maintaining the lake house required tax payments and repairs that my father's struggling business could no longer support. She claimed that selling the property would eliminate their commercial debts and establish dedicated college funds for both Hannah and me. When I reminded her that Grandma Evelyn wanted the cabin preserved, my mother's gentle tone vanished for a second before she smoothed her skirt and said that sentimentality did not cover property tax bills. Right on cue, my father walked into the room and announced that he had already found a buyer offering a fair price. When I asked him specifically who the buyer was, he hesitated briefly before stating it was a reputable regional builder that Michael had connected with through his real estate firm. I did not push the issue any further, simply telling him I would think it over, which was enough to satisfy him for the moment. Later that evening, my younger sister Hannah came into my bedroom and sat on the edge of my mattress, picking at a loose thread on the blanket. She looked up at me nervously and admitted she had overheard our parents whispering in the kitchen late at night about high financial stakes and tight deadlines, asking if something bad was happening to our family. I pulled the quilt over her shoulders and told her not to worry about adult problems, promising her that everything was going to be taken care of. 3 days before my birthday, Uncle Michael intercepted me in the driveway as I was bringing groceries in from my car. He leaned against his sedan wearing casual weekend clothes, offering a broad, practiced smile as he asked if we could talk privately for a minute. We sat on the concrete front steps, where he leaned in and explained that the raw land at Cedar Lake was worth $450,000 on the open market, repeating his offer that he could secure $50,000 in cash for my college education if I supported the transaction. I looked at him directly and asked whose name currently appeared on the official land deed. His smile faltered for a fraction of a second, a tiny adjustment around his eyes, before he recovered his composure and claimed the property belonged to my late grandparents, meaning legal ownership automatically passed to my father and him as next of kin. He spoke with complete confidence, assuming a teenager would never understand estate law, but he was relying on my ignorance to pull off his deal. I told him I would consider his offer, and as he drove down the street, I could see him speaking frantically into his phone through his side mirror. The evening before my birthday, I drove out to Cedar Lake alone. The water was still under the moonlight, and the white pines stood dark against the sky. I walked up the porch steps, sat in the wooden chair next to the one my grandfather used to occupy, and listened to the wind moving through the trees. Opening my laptop, I reviewed the final PDF package sent by Kathleen Miller. The formal acceptance of successor beneficiary document, the asset summary, and the trustee authorization forms, all flagged with red digital signature tags ready for midnight. Sitting on that porch, tears welled up in my eyes, not out of fear, but from a deep, quiet sadness. I wished with all my heart that my father was the kind of man who would take his daughter fishing on that lake instead of calculating its square-foot commercial value, and I wished my mother had cared about my memories as much as she cared about appearances. I hated that I had to rely on legal documents to defend myself against the very people who were supposed to protect me, but I knew that emotional wishes held no weight in a court of law. I dried my face, locked the cabin door, drove back to Ridgemont, and set my phone alarm for 11:45 p.m. At 11:50 p.m., I closed my bedroom door, muted the hallway lights, and logged into a secure video session with Kathleen Miller. She appeared on my screen from her home office, wearing her reading glasses and holding the legal folder. When the digital clock on my screen turned to midnight, marking my 18th birthday, I executed the successor beneficiary acceptance form officially cementing my legal control over the Tremaine family irrevocable trust alongside Kathleen as co-trustee. Kathleen confirmed that the signed document was legally binding and stated she would be waiting at the county recorder's office at 8:00 a.m. sharp to file the lease pendens public notice. That filing meant that even if my father and uncle attempted to record their fraudulent quitclaim deed later that morning, the clerk system would automatically reject it due to the established trust ownership and active legal freeze. While I was completing those forms in my bedroom, my Uncle Michael was sitting in his kitchen across town, printing out a generic quitclaim document and a forged notary stamp he had acquired to bypass legal verification. He had called my father at 11:30 p.m. to confirm they would file at 9:00 a.m., making sure I would be completely preoccupied with my birthday party before I realized what had happened. Michael had signed a binding contract with Lakeview Properties that carried a mandatory $45,000 penalty clause if he failed to deliver an unencumbered title within 30 days, betting nearly $500,000 on a property he had no legal right to touch. My birthday party began at 4 o'clock the following afternoon. Our living room was packed with nearly 20 guests, including neighborhood families, church friends, my father's business associates, and Carol, an elderly neighbor who lived down the road from our cabin at Cedar Lake. There were silver balloons, a large banner pinned across the wall, and a decorated sheet cake sitting on the dining table. In my jacket pocket was the signed trust acceptance copy, folded neatly, though I had no need to show it to anyone yet. Around 5 o'clock, my father tapped his glass with a spoon to gather everyone's attention. He delivered a short speech about how proud he and my mother were that I had turned 18, before adjusting his posture and announcing to the entire room that our family had made an important decision regarding our future. He looked directly at the crowd and stated that to ensure financial security for our household, we had decided to put the Cedar Lake cabin on the market, turning to me with a fixed smile as he asked if I was excited about our next chapter. The entire room fell silent, waiting for my reaction. I set my paper plate down on the table, looked my father straight in the eye, and said clearly that I had never agreed to sell my grandparents' house. My father's smile stiffened instantly, and he tried to laugh it off, telling the guests it was just birthday nerves, but I repeated my statement without flinching. Uncle Michael stepped forward from the hallway, his voice tight as he suggested we refrain from making a scene in front of company, but I met his gaze and told him that the proper time for discussing the property title was at 8:00 a.m. tomorrow morning. Michael's phone began vibrating in his pocket, but he did not answer it, and the room grew so uncomfortable that guests began quietly gathering their coats to leave. Within 30 minutes, the house was empty except for my immediate family, Uncle Michael, and Carol, who had remained near the kitchen doorway. The moment the front door clicked shut, my mother turned on me with sharp frustration, demanding to know if I had any understanding of the financial pressure my father was facing with his failing business. She stepped closer and raised her voice, claiming that our suburban home was at risk and accusing me of being selfish for holding onto a recreational cabin when the family needed cash. Before I could respond, Carol stepped into the kitchen and spoke in a firm, steady tone, telling my mother that I had every right to consult a lawyer and that my grandmother Evelyn would have wanted her land protected. My mother snapped back that this was an internal family matter, but Carol remained standing by my side, stating she had been Evelyn's close friend for 40 years and knew precisely what my grandparents intended for that property. Carol gave my arm a gentle squeeze, looked my mother in the eye, and quietly exited through the front door. Once we were alone, my father closed the kitchen door, sat down heavily at the table, and laid out his terms in a hard, uncompromising voice. He stated that he and Michael were driving to the county recorder's office the following morning to file their transfer documents, sell the land, and hand me $50,000, warning me that if I attempted to fight them in court, I would be cut off financially, removed from the house, and offered no assistance for college expenses. I stood up from the table, looked at my father, and told him that I was part of this family, but I was the part that actually kept promises. I walked past my uncle, stepped around Hannah, who was sitting quietly on the stairs with her arms pulled around her knees, and went upstairs to my room. At 8:00 a.m. the next morning, Kathleen Miller was the first person through the doors at the county recorder's office. She presented the certified Tremaine family trust agreements alongside the fresh lease pendens notice, and the clerk processed and stamped the documents into the public record within 10 minutes. From that second forward, the title record explicitly showed that the property was legally locked inside an irrevocable trust managed by Kathleen and myself. At 8:14 a.m., Kathleen called to confirm the filing was complete. Downstairs, my father and uncle were getting dressed in their suits, preparing to head downtown with their folder. As my father grabbed his truck keys near the front entrance, I looked up from the kitchen table and wished them good luck. My father hesitated for a moment, looking at me with a confused expression, before turning and walking out the door. At 9:05 a.m., Uncle Michael walked up to the county counter and slid his quitclaim deed across the desk with a confident nod, while my father stood behind him with his hands in his pockets. The clerk typed the parcel number into her terminal, reviewed the screen for a moment, and informed Michael that she could not record the transfer document. When Michael angrily demanded to know why, the clerk pointed out that the title had been registered under an irrevocable trust 6 years ago, and a fresh asterisk lis pendens had been filed that very morning by attorney Kathleen Miller. My father stepped up to the counter in shock, insisting there was no trust and that their parents had never created one, but the clerk simply advised them to contact the designated trustee listed on the public record. Michael's face turned completely pale as he realized that the name on the business card he had pulled from my bag weeks earlier was now permanently anchored to the property record. My father turned to Michael in a rage, demanding to know why his brother, a licensed real estate broker, had failed to run a basic title search before dragging them into a land deal. At 9:22 a.m., my phone rang while I was sitting on our front porch. My father's voice was shaking with anger as he demanded to know what I had done behind their backs. I kept my voice calm and told him I had simply accepted the trust my grandparents had set up for me 6 years ago, adding that Grandpa Arthur had created the trust not because he lacked love for his sons, but because he knew they could not be trusted with the land. A heavy, painful silence stretched over the line before my father threatened to take the matter to court, but I reminded him that the trust was legally irrevocable, meaning even I could not dismantle it now. He slammed the phone down without another word. Moments later, I received another call from Mark Reynolds, the senior developer at Lakeview Properties. He spoke in a rapid, formal tone, explaining that Michael had signed a contract guaranteeing a clear title for the Cedar Lake lot and asking if I was willing to negotiate a direct sale with the trust. I told him clearly that the cabin was not for sale under any circumstances. Reynolds went silent for a few seconds before stating that his company would be initiating immediate legal proceedings against my uncle for breach of contract, fraud, and the mandatory $45,000 failure penalty. That afternoon, Kathleen called with additional news from the county clerk. Upon reviewing the rejected quitclaim deed Michael had submitted, officials discovered that the notary stamp affixed to the page was completely fraudulent and belonged to no registered official in the state. Submitting a forged public document was a felony offense, and the recorder's office had already forwarded the paperwork directly to the district attorney's office for criminal investigation. When my father came home at 2 o'clock that afternoon, he walked into the house looking defeated. He sat down at the dining table across from me, his voice flat as he admitted that his building supply store was bankrupt, and the bank was demanding $180,000 in personal loan repayments. He tried one last time to convince me to dissolve the trust, but I had already placed Kathleen Miller on speakerphone from my pocket. Kathleen spoke clearly through the speaker, informing my father that attempting to contest a 6-year-old irrevocable trust executed by competent adults would cost him tens of thousands in legal fees and end in absolute failure. My father looked at me, and for the first time in my life, I saw total realization in his eyes. Over the next 3 weeks, the fallout hit my family hard. Lakeview Properties filed a civil lawsuit against Uncle Michael seeking over $100,000 in penalties, damages, and legal expenses. The Real Estate Licensing Board suspended Michael's broker license pending the criminal investigation into the forged notary stamp, effectively stripping him of his career. Small-town word spread quickly, and soon everyone at the local grocery stores and community centers knew that Arthur Tremin's sons had tried to illegally sell his land and were stopped by his granddaughter. My father did not attempt to fight the trust. Instead, he sold off the remaining inventory of his building supply business at a loss to satisfy his bank obligations, barely managing to keep our family home. My mother had to take a full-time clerk job at a local pharmacy, her first job in over 10 years, to help cover monthly bills. I packed my belongings, moved out of my parents' house, and took up permanent residence at the Cedar Lake cabin. I enrolled at Ridgemont Community College to study environmental science, utilizing a dedicated $58,000 educational trust fund that my grandparents had quietly set aside for my college expenses 6 years earlier, the exact same amount my father and uncle had tried to bribe me with. A month after moving in, I met my parents at a neutral coffee shop on Birch Street. Sitting across from them, I made it entirely clear that while I still loved them, our future relationship would be built on mutual respect and strict boundaries, not on financial exploitation or guilt. My father looked down at his cup and nodded silently, accepting the terms. Later that spring, my sister Hannah came out to visit me at the cabin on a Sunday afternoon. We sat on the front porch eating pizza, watching the calm water reflect the white pines along the shore, talking about her school projects and her plans for the summer. For the first time in years, there were no hidden motives, no quiet arguments about money, and no underlying tension, just two sisters sitting together in a place built on love. I kept my promise to my grandparents, and in doing so, I learned that true security does not come from winning an argument or hurting the people who tried to push you down. It comes from standing firm on solid ground, keeping your word, and protecting the things that actually matter. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to Payback Stories for a new family drama story every day, and I'll see you in the next one.